Professor Porpora to give his presentation.
Well, I think as the last speaker, you're probably all happy to see me. I want to begin by just saying I'm very honored to be here, and I thank the Chancellor and the President of the Academy for inviting me. I'm going to build on the kind of relationality that Pier Paolo has just introduced and that, as was indicated, Maggie also shares. In terms of a relationality, there are several relations that are pivotal to trafficking and to the analytically separate category of forced labor, sexual and non-sexual. The first important relation is inequality, a global inequality that renders some countries underdeveloped and others what we might call overdeveloped. They're overdeveloped in their consumption of more than their fair share of the Earth's bounty. Global inequality creates both the supply and the demand for forced labor. It's the cheapness of the production factor afforded by forced labor that creates its demand, and the destitution of the forced laborers that creates its supply. As Stefano has noted as well, the problem of inequality has been accentuated in our neoliberal era by free trade agreements that grant great mobility to capital. As one financier put it, capital now has wings. Capital can deal with 20 labor markets all at once and pick and choose among them. Labor is fixed in place. So there's been a dramatic shift in the balance of power between capital and labor, an imbalance that is itself a relation. And it's out of that imbalance that we get the forced labor tied to migration. Next to inequality, the second major relation at issue is capitalist competition, which requires each competitor to keep down prices, which in turn motivates each to keep down production costs. The ICAT report misses the relationality here. It represents cost minimization as a norm among capitalist enterprises, when in fact it is a vital interest. It will not work, therefore, just to counsel enterprises to adopt different norms. Rather, new legal norms need to be applied to restructure capitalist interests. And that interest restructuring is precisely what Britain's Supply Chain Transparency Act does. So norms, interests, and relations are intertwined. One way they're intertwined is in the market mentality that emerges from a now globalized capitalism. That market mentality leads, am I there? Leads to the, where am I? That market mentality leads to the commodification of everything. People, their work, and their sexuality. The market pressures to reduce I-thou relations to I-it. Thus we find traffickers referring to the people they traffic as things they own, and prostitution clients thinking of instant sex as on par with instant coffee. Is a market mentality that thinks... Too near. Is this better? Okay. It is a market mentality that thinks that a person's very human rights and their body parts are available for purchase. That same mentality shows up everywhere. I see it in my students who are eager to have their entire college experience reduced to the value added that will make them better commodities on the job market. They too need to be reminded that they're not just commodities, but called to be fully actualized persons with sacred value. Paradoxically, however, the market does not just treat us as commodities. At the same time, it valorizes us as consumers. Indeed, the free trade agreements I spoke of earlier are directed to our interests as consumers. In fact, it seems as if a major economic function of those in the overdeveloped world, like my country, the United States, is to consume, and thereby provide consumer demand for the global economy. From that perspective, low costs are not just in the interests of consumers, they become a norm, an expectation of a lifestyle to which consumers in the overdeveloped world become accustomed. Not to consume at the present level is felt as a deprivation. Yet from the vegetables picked by migrant labor to our smartphones, the price of much of what we consume derives from exploited labor, to labor that is not paid a living wage or a wage in other countries that is a fraction of what would be paid in our own. A portion is also based on labor that is not only exploitative, but forced. Miria told us that consumers of forced labor are all around us. In truth, they are us. The fair trade movement attempts to right that wrong. But if all workers are to be paid a higher, fairer wage for what they produce, consumers in the overdeveloped world will have to downsize their consumption by adopting simpler lifestyles. That moral downshift, however, conflicts with current consumer and corporate norms and interests. We are shielded from the exploitation on which much of our way of life depends, partly by geographic and partly by social distance. We just do not personally witness the exploitation involved. But it's not just shielding that inures us to the exploitation that grounds our way of life. It is also the normalcy of it into which we are born, and also a non-relational individualism that affects both popular and academic thought. That non-relational individualism is voiced in economics by Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, who tells us that no voluntary exchange will take place unless both parties benefit. Let me say that again. According to Friedman, no voluntary exchange will take place unless both parties benefit. I was pleased to see Stefano also take issue with Friedman's remark, so that it's not only a sociologist dumping on an economist. The problem with Friedman's claim that all exchanges are mutually beneficial is that it undermines our understanding of exploitation. To see so, remember the question first raised by Victor and then by Stefano and others. What does it mean for an exchange to be voluntary? Certainly no exchange is voluntary that is based on physical force. But there are other kinds of force that operate. Legal force, psychological force, the force of circumstance, just having nowhere else to go. The force of circumstance returns us to relations, where the disadvantaged position of one person relative to another is a relation of which the advantaged. Is that better? Oh. I'm sorry. A relation of which the advantage can take advantage. When such advantage of disadvantage is taken, the ensuing relation is not truly to the benefit of the disadvantaged party. Thus, what makes even non-physically forced prostitution still involuntary are the conditions of sex inequality, abuse, and destitution that drive women into it. Friedman's individualist, non-relational understanding is also one of the general sensibilities that allow non-sexual labor exploitation to continue. On Friedman's account, no transaction is exploitative, that laborers choose of their own volition. It matters not how desperate their circumstances. On this account, insofar as being paid half a minimum wage is better than not being paid at all, it is to the worker's benefit to accept the deal. So is being paid a quarter of the minimum wage, and so on. The same goes for any adverse working conditions, even prostitution. As I say, Friedman's non-relational individualism is widely shared. Thus, while there's almost universal opprobrium of slavery, we as a general public are much more accepting of all manner of exploitation short of it. Yes, forced labor or slavery is only one end of a whole spectrum of labor violations, what has been called capitalism at its worst. As it stands, the intense consumer demand for low prices is reflected backward, as derived demand for low production costs among end suppliers, in many cases large corporations. Normally, the large corporations do not themselves directly employ forced labor, but they also often do not check back to ensure that the same purity is practiced by their suppliers. On the contrary, the large corporate end suppliers project the pressure for low prices back onto their suppliers. That pressure actually does encourage the smaller scale, less formal suppliers of the corporate suppliers to employ forced labor. One problem is that the enslaved often work side by side with the unenslaved, documented or not, who experience the same working conditions and only meager pay. In such cases, as discussed yesterday, in relation to Sally's paper, it is difficult to distinguish the two categories. Regardless, the fundamental issue here is labor rights and the dignity of work. So how do we use norms to affect demand? Let me make a distinction between purely regulative norms and norms that come from the heart, that express conventional expectation or something deeper. Purely regulative norms, which Mackie has analyzed in her recent work, and I think that Pierre Powell was referring to in terms of repressive norms, change, they're kind of just administrative, and they change not our hearts, but only our behavior, by changing our interest in the behavior, often by attaching a penalty or cost to it. Regulative norms include criminalizing the use of prostitutions, as in the Nordic model, or the kind of supply chain transparency measure enacted in both California and the UK, which holds corporations responsible for their supply chains. These norms work by attacking demand extrinsically. That is, they do not intrinsically change the perceived benefit of what is demanded, but reduce interest by making what is demanded more costly. I must say, though, that by changing interests and behavior, culture can sometimes change as well. So with the Supply Chain Act, for example, with the Supply Chain Act, corporate cultures might adapt to become more morally invested in the nature of their supply chains. We'll have to see. It's also possible that with criminalizing prostitution, those who would use prostitutes come to change their ways, their views as well. It's more difficult, however, to affect change of demand through a more intrinsic change of heart, the kind of deeper normative change for which Sister Eugenia called. For this deeper change, in the case of prostitution, it is the client's intrinsic understanding of sexuality that must change, as well as his regard for all women. He must cease being like the man who, although he visits prostitutes, said he could never marry one because he's an old-fashioned good Catholic. With regard to forced labor more broadly, it is the general public, both as citizens and consumers, that must change. As John said as well, it is the general public as citizens who must press the governments for new legislation related to prostitution, forced labor, and as in my own country, but in the EU as well, to immigration. But it is also as consumers that the general public and the overdeveloped world must change. In the long run, they must come to terms with downsized consumption. Fair trade purchasing, as I noted, one step the public can take. Another is what is called local purchasing, which favors local products and food. Local purchasing enables greater knowledge of and responsibility for supply chains. Where supply chains sprawl around the world, it is very difficult to know the conditions under which things are produced. Where goods are produced locally, it is much easier to ensure that production does not depend on enslaved or exploited labor. Of course, we could also use product labeling, as John had suggested. All such efforts, however, if successful, will result in a downsized, more responsible consumption. The question is whether the general publics in the overdeveloped world are willing to make that kind of a sacrifice. Pope Francis has spoken of the globalization of indifference, and the social creation of moral indifference, or what looks like indifference, has occupied a good deal of my own work. Sometimes it is not that the public is actually indifferent, but uninformed. The job then is to inform them. Sometimes, however, the problem goes beyond a lack of information to general mindset. Just as buying sex appears normal to many clients of prostitution, a marketplace built on exploited labor appears normal to many ordinary consumers. In such context, it is not the purchase of such goods and services that appears deviant, but its repudiation. Just as in a world that commodifies everything, clients of prostitution come to think of sex that way, so do consumers in general come to think of all labor as just a commodity. The sanctity of labor needs to be reclaimed. Even when the general public comes to see the problem, there still can be what is called a value-action gap, a failure of the members of the public to act on the values they have. Sometimes, as in the case of the diffusion of responsibility, each one sees the initiative as someone else's to take. The need then is to organize responsibility. In a neoliberal world with weakened unions, the church as a social movement is one of the remaining sources of organized change. Sometimes, even when the public comes to see the problem, there remains what I have called a macro-moral disconnect, a failure of the public to see that morality entails not just what each does alone within the sphere of one's own private life, but also how all act together as a collective in the public sphere. There's a need for the church to emphasize sins of omission as well as commission, and once again, like the liberation theologians of the 1980s, to speak forcibly of collective as well as of individual sin. As Christina and Miria both pointed out, we're uncomfortable with what Stefano cites as our market complicity, our individual complicity in the collective wrongs through our participation in a social market system. There's a tendency, therefore, to deny our complicity through what sociologists call techniques of neutralization. Techniques of neutralization are psychological techniques through which we deny our responsibility for the corrective wrongs to which we contribute. There are a whole range of these techniques that I can exemplify, beginning with traffickers. One such technique is the denial of victimization, as when slavers say they help the enslaved to survive, or that the enslaved get used to their position. Nancy tells us how organ buyers dismiss the worth of sellers. Another technique is to point to the role of others, as in the case of an Indian brothel owner who emphasized parental control, saying, "My girls are here to earn money. Their parents want this." Politicians likewise defer responsibility by saying, for example, it's a cop's job, not a politician's, to root out crime and corruption. Corporate executives might do the same, attributing full responsibility to their suppliers and ignoring their own complicity in exchange. We begin to see how we ourselves, as the general public, can employ the same techniques to neutralize our own complicity in the collective sin. The general public, too, might deny that exploited laborers are really victims. The public, too, may blame the parents or just the traffickers, or just say it is not their job to right these wrongs. The job belongs rather to the politicians, who in turn say it's the job of the police. This moral breakdown is what we mean by a diffusion of responsibility, and it's a problem when it comes to righting collective wrongs. To overcome it, we need to be convicted, called to our higher selves and to our global responsibilities. We cannot be allowed to narrow what is called our universe of obligation. The general public must be brought out of its individualism to view themselves as what in their forthcoming book, Maggie and Pierpaolo, call relational subjects, each connected ontologically to all. Again, our religious bodies must mobilize their faithful and not allow them to think that their obligations are fulfilled by what they do at home or in their own small neighborhoods. They cannot be allowed to think that commerce is a domain separate from morality. Sometimes, finally, when the public comes to see the problem, and even when it comes to own its responsibility to redress it, members of the public can find themselves morally saturated. So many problems, how to address them all. Again, the church can help by finding the common core to these problems, thereby bring them all within the compass of a common agenda. How to do that? If the normalcy of untempered commodification is the ultimate problem on the demand side, then it is that normalcy that needs to be challenged, and it needs to be challenged by calling on the general public, both as consumers and as citizens, to challenge it. How to do that? The solution mirrors the problem. To reach a half-attentive, oversaturated public, messages have to be repeated. On one estimate, to move audiences from unawareness to action requires anywhere from 7 to 15 exposures and sometimes more. The repetition needs to be across multiple media, and it needs to be consistent. It's something to remember as we develop our websites. The problem for the church is that it has many issues to which it wants the public, or at least its own members, to respond. The problem is that each such call eclipses the others, and all together drown the audience in conflicting, competing messages. But just as the problem comes to a head in commodification, so can the solution. If on the demand side the ultimate problem is a complete reduction of sex, persons, and labor to commodities, then it is the sanctity of each that must be reclaimed. As sanctity is abstract and therefore encompassing, the message can be repeated, and repeated without being repetitive. It need not be repetitive because each individual message can speak of sanctification in relation to a different issue, sexuality, persons, labor, in relation to different aspects. In terms of different aspects, we find again how tied trafficking is to immigration, another issue where the Catholic Church has been on the forefront in the United States. Different issues can thus be combined under more encompassing emotional commitments. What I'm suggesting was done in 1983 when U.S. Cardinal Joseph Bernardin popularized the term seamless garment. It was a soundbite and an effective one. It collected under one overarching notion that issues such as abortion, capital punishment, militarism, euthanasia, social injustice, and economic injustice all demand the consistent application of moral principles that value the sacredness of human life. The seamless garment was a piece of political marketing. If the church is to have an effect on the demand side of human trafficking, it is to political marketing that the church must turn. To sum up, words I'm sure you like to hear, when it comes to the reduction of demand in human trafficking through normative change, the problem and the solution mirror each other. In both respects, we need a broader perspective beyond trafficking itself. In the end, the demand side of human trafficking is rooted in an economically based degradation of human sexuality, the human person, and human work. To challenge that degradation in a distracted, half-attentive world, the church's counter-message must be repeated under a more encompassing umbrella. What the church needs to do, I suggest, is to push for the re-sanctification of the human person, a re-sanctification of sexuality, and a re-sanctification of human work. Thank you.